Amazing Old West stories. Howdy, partner. Pull up a chair and settle in. You're about to ride through tales of grit, honor, and the wild heart of the frontier. These stories ain't just history. They're legends come alive. So kick back, relax, and let the dust of the Old West stir your imagination. And don't forget to holler in the comments. Tell us where you're tuning in from and which story hits home for you. The campfire's lit and the trail's just getting started. Echoes of Coyote Gulch. The desert held its breath at Coyote Gulch, where the cliffs blushed crimson at sunset and shadows stretched long as the regrets of men. It was land older than memory, where only the brave or the desperate carved out a sin. Living. In the spring of 1879, a one-eyed preacher rode into the gulch with a cross on his chest and a rifle under his coat. Folks called him Gideon Black, though none knew if that was his real name. He said little, but when he spoke, his words carried the weight of storms. Coyote Gulch had once been a boomtown, fat with silver and louder than sin. But the veins ran. Dried, the saloons shuttered, and most moved on. What remained was a ghost of ambition, a few squatters, one old mine, and an outlaw gang known as the Petty Knives. Led by a man named Jarl Tannic, the Knives ruled the gulch with blood and fear. They demanded tribute from what few ranchers still ran sheep in the hills, robbed the stage once a month like clockwork, and left warnings etched into barn doors. A crude knife drawn in charcoal. The local law had long since vanished, and telegrams to the county seat went unanswered. Hope was thinner than rain. Gideon Black settled in the abandoned church, fixing the roof, ringing the bell, and planting corn in the yard like a man unbothered by threats. The townsfolk watched from behind, curtains waiting for the Knives to burn it down. But the gang didn't come that first week. On Sunday, Gideon preached to an empty room. By the second week, 3 people came. By the third, the church was half full. It wasn't the sermons that brought them. It was the quiet strength in Gideon's. The way he spoke of courage, like it was a crop that grew if you watered it with faith and fire. Then came the warning. One morning, the door of the church bore the knife mark, slashed deep with a hunting blade. That night, the bell tower burned, and Gideon dragged water with his bare hands to save the structure. The next morning, he rode. Out, he found the Knives' camp in the canyon. Beyond the gulch, 20 men with rifles, whiskey, and no reason to fear a preacher. He offered no sermon, just a warning. Leave Coyote Gulch or meet judgment not in heaven, but here by gun and end. Grit, they laughed. 3 days later, one of them was found hogtied outside the general store. A note pinned to his chest. Your soul is still yours. Keep it that way. Another turned up in the church pews, hat in hand, eyes wide with some story he wouldn't share. One by one, the Knives began to splinter. Some fled, some turned on each other, and some tried to strike back. Gideon met them in the canyon, in the streets, in the dark, when they thought him alone. He carried no posse, only justice and a past he never spoke of. Jarl Tannic was the last to fall. He rode into town with dynamite, strapped to his saddle, screaming. Of devils and vengeance? Gideon faced him in front of the church as the sky cracked with lightning. There were no witnesses to what happened next, only the sound of one gunshot and the slow collapse of thunder. Tannic was buried under unmarked stone. The church bell was replaced, and the people of Coyote Gulch found themselves speaking softer and standing taller. Gideon stayed through the next winter, then vanished as quietly as he came. Some said he left for another dying town. Others believed he was an angel in boots. But on Sunday mornings, the bell still rings. And when trouble whispers through the red dust, the people of the Gulch remember the man with one eye, a preacher's collar, and a gunslinger's soul. The echoes of Coyote Gulch carry far, and they all speak his name. Trail of the Silent Star. In the far reaches of Arizona Territory, where the red cliffs met the endless sage, there rode a marshal who never spoke a word. Folks called him the Silent Star. He wore his badge low, just above a coat weathered by dust and years, and his name had long been forgotten or traded for legend. He arrived in Iron Tooth one summer evening when the wind felt thick with warning. The town had once been a silver boom camp, now half empty but stubbornly alive. One saloon, one jail, and too many guns. The sheriff, a man named Crosby, was buried 2 days before, shot outside the general store over a crooked poker game. The town council, made up of storekeepers and the schoolmarm, sent for help. The Silent Star came instead. He rode in alone, dismounted slow, and handed the town clerk a paper with 3 words: appointed by judge. He took the badge and the keys and slept in the jailhouse without saying a thing. Some thought he was a ghost in boots. Others said he been cursed after the war. But no one challenged him, not after the first night. A man named Pike tried to push him, a big fella from Colorado with fists like fence posts. He charged into the saloon, called the marshal a mute coward, and drew his knife. The marshal didn't blink. He stepped forward, caught Pike's wrist, and slammed him through a table. He never drew his gun, but Pike left town the next morning with a limp and a lesson. Trouble had been building in Iron Tooth long before the Star arrived. A gang known as the Selman Riders had been shaking down ranchers and robbing the northbound stage. They wore gray dusters and red kerchiefs, led by a man called Rig the Lantern, so named for the lamp he carried at night raids, said to burn green as envy and twice as cruel. The riders claimed to protect Iron Tooth from worse men, but they took what they pleased, and no one dared say no. Until the Silent Star came. He started small, posting signs about curfews, carrying out the drunks, patching up fences for old Miss Harlow, whose son had vanished last spring. He wrote more than he spoke, and when he needed to, his whistle-sharp 2 notes was enough to still a room. Then, one night, a young boy named Jesse ran into town, breathless and bloody. He said the riders had hit his family's ranch, took his father, burned their stock, and rode off laughing. Jesse had hidden in the root cellar, clutching a tin star his father once wore. The star took that badge and pinned it to his coat beside his own. He saddled his horse, checked his colt, and rode out into the dark. 3 days passed. On the 4th morning, he came back, dragging 2 of the riders behind him, tied and bruised. He said nothing, just locked them in the cells and posted a note: Rig comes next. The town changed after that. Men stood straighter, women walked freer, and the store stayed open past dusk. Jesse began sweeping the jail each morning, watching the star with wide eyes, learning the weight of silence and the strength behind it. Rig didn't take long to answer. He came with 15 men, torches and rifles, surrounding the town like wolves at a campfire. He called out, demanding his riders, threatening to burn Iron Tooth to ash. The marshal stepped into the street. Alone, Jesse stood behind him, holding the smaller star badge, hand shaking but proud. Rig laughed. You gonna face all of us, mute? What kind of lawman are you? The star didn't answer. He raised a flare gun and fired it into the night sky. From the cliffs, gunfire answered. A dozen riders swept down from the hills, men and women from nearby towns. Ranchers, old soldiers, some who'd once worn a star, and some who never had but understood what was right. The ambush scattered Rig's men. Chaos roared through the dust. Jesse took cover inside the sheriff's office, clutching the barred door as bullets cracked like thunder. Rig tried to flee, riding hard for the river pass. But the star followed, relentless as shadow. They met under a dry arroyo, where blood from old wars still stained the rock. Rig fired first. The star shot last. By dawn, Iron Tooth had its piece. The marshal stayed another year, helping rebuild, teaching Jesse how to ride, how to read, and how to keep your word without shouting it. When he left, he gave Jesse the tin star and wrote one final note. The badge is heavy. Carry it with honor. He rode west, where the sky leans low and the wind never tells secrets. Some say he guards another town now. Others think he vanished into the hills to find whatever pieces of himself still wandered. But in Iron Tooth, when dust stirs across the street and silence feels like steel, they remember the man who said nothing and stood for everything. Rustlers of Red Valley. The sky above Red Valley was a hard blue, baked dry by months without rain. Wind moved across the mesa like a whisper, stirring the red dust and carrying it through the cottonwoods and down to the river bends. In this land of dust and stone, the only laws that lasted were the ones written with grit and iron. The town of Dry Bend sat crooked near the edge of the valley, a collection of shacks and storefronts leaning under the weight of sun and time. It had a bank, a saloon, a blacksmith who also pulled teeth, and a sheriff who hadn't drawn his gun. In years, folks there lived quiet, if not entirely honest, lives. That changed when the rustlers came. They struck at night, riding down from the high rocks with faces covered and rifles ready. In a single week, they ran off over 100 head of cattle, burned 2 barns, and shot the eldest Murphy boy who tried to stop them. They left no names, no tracks worth following, just the mark of a red V carved into fence posts and door frames. The ranchers met in the back of the dry goods store, too angry for coffee and too poor for lawyers. Among them was Harlan Finch, a former Texas Ranger turned homesteader who had hung up his badge to raise cattle and raise his daughter Lila. "We can't wait for help," he said, voice like gravel on steel. "These men ain't just thieves. They're here to take the valley." The others nodded. Some looked to the sheriff, who looked to his boots. So Harlan stood up. Over the next 2 weeks, he and a few willing hands rode out to every ranch, mapping patterns, marking signs, and setting up night watches. They caught one rustler barely. 16, half-starved and scared stiff. From him, they learned that the gang was led by a man named Elias Ward, a former Union scout turned bandit, who believed Red Valley belonged to no one but him. Harlan knew that name. Years ago, he and Ward had shared a tent during the war. Harlan had gone home. Ward had gone feral. The next hit came with smoke and fury. The Deansmore place, 5 miles south, was leveled. The family barely escaped, riding bareback to town with fire in their wake. That night, Harlan gathered 6 riders' old soldiers, angry sons, and 1 blacksmith who owed the Deansmores his life. Lila begged to come. He told her no. They rode through the night, tracking the rustlers to a box canyon hidden behind Devil's Bluff. There, beneath an overhang of stone, Ward's men had built a camp. Corrals, tents, and stolen livestock penned. Tight, Harlan waited until dawn. The sun rose with gunfire. The riders hit the camp fast, yelling, firing, driving the cattle forward like a living, battering ram. Chaos tore through the canyon. Ward himself stepped into the open, shotgun raised. He saw Harlan and smiled. "Knew you'd come," he said. They traded words and then bullets. Harlan took a graze to the shoulder. Ward fell with a shot to the leg. The rest scattered, fleeing into the hills or surrendering where they stood. The cattle were driven back to the valley. Ward was locked in the old jail, and the sheriff found new reason to clean his star. Red Valley breathed again, cautiously. But the story didn't end there. Harlan knew others would come. Men who thought the West was still lawless and ripe for the taking. So he and Lila, now riding with a rifle across her saddle, formed the Riders. League a loose alliance of ranchers and townsfolk sworn to defend their land. They called themselves the Red Valley Guard. Over the years, they stopped 3 more gangs, built a schoolhouse, and brought in a circuit judge who held trials beneath a cottonwood tree. The town grew, not fast, but firm. The Red V that once marked fear became a badge of pride, repurposed on the gate to Harlan's ranch as a sign of victory. When Harlan passed, they buried him on a hill overlooking the valley, beside the old war rifle he never truly set down. Lila took over, earning her own legend as the woman who rode harder than any man and never missed a shot. And in Dry Bend, when dust rises from the canyon and the sky turns gold, folks still say the rustlers might come again. But so will the Guard, and Red Valley won't bend easy. Cattle Queen's Vengeance. The high country wind cut sharp through the pine, rolling down from the Wyoming bighorns and sweeping across the open range. Snow still clung to the ridges, but the grass was waking in the valleys. Spring had come late. In 1889, and with it, trouble. Eleanor Ellie McCrae stood on the porch of the Bar M Ranch, the wide land of her late husband stretching before her like a promise half kept. 5 years earlier, she had arrived a city girl, newly wed to Angus McCrae, a rough-edged cattleman with a kind heart and iron will. Together, they built a ranch from little more than canvas tents, sweat, and dreams. Then came the rustlers. Angus was gunned down one dusk while riding back from the north pasture. No one saw it happen, but the signs were clear. Empty rifle scabbard, spent shells in the dirt, and cattle missing again. The sheriff shrugged. The neighbors whispered, and Ellie buried her husband under the lone pine by the creek. Most expected her to sell the land, pack her things, and head back east. Instead, she saddled up. With only 2 loyal ranch hands, Cal Taggart, a veteran of the Indian Wars with a limp and a sharp eye, and Bertie Lane, a young woman with a knack. For horses and a past she'd never share, Ellie took over the Bar M. She cut her dresses into riding skirts, learned to shoot straight, and kept books by lantern light. Within a year, she turned the ranch profitable again, even buying up parcels, and in by scared homesteaders. Folks began calling her the Cattle Queen of Custer County, though not always kindly. The title stuck anyway. The rustling didn't stop. Word came that a powerful syndicate, known as the Big Horn Alliance, had been pressuring smaller ranchers. To sell, those who refused saw their herds vanish, their homes burn, or worse. The leaders of the alliance were shielded by lawyers, hired guns, and the silence of fear. Ellie wasn't having it. She rode north to the county seat, demanded a land review, and was told to stay quiet or risk everything. She returned with fury in her chest and a plan in her hands. With Cal and Bertie, Ellie mapped every lost cow, marked every broken fence, and tracked every rider seen near their lands. She wrote letters to senators, telegrams to editors, and began stockpiling supplies like a rancher at war. When the alliance struck again, this time torching a winter haystack and running off 20 head, Ellie rode after them. They tracked the trail through moonlight and mist, deep into outlaw country, where even the U.S. Marshals stayed away. They found the cattle penned near a line shack owned by Boone Mather, a known gunman with ties to the alliance. Ellie didn't wait for a warrant. She and Cal surrounded the shack, while Bertie slipped in through the back. Shots rang out, but only one man was wounded, Boone himself, who fell with a scream and a shattered shoulder. The others surrendered, surprised and outmatched. Ellie brought the men into town herself, trailing the stolen cattle behind her. The story exploded like dry brush in a windstorm. The Cheyenne Gazette called her the widow with a rifle, and the rancher who brought law to outlaw land. Public pressure mounted. The governor ordered a state investigation. Names were named, deeds exposed, and before summer's end, the Bighorn Alliance crumbled like old timber. Ellie expanded the Bar M, turning it into a waypoint for honest ranchers, and a safe harbor for widows and orphaned hands. She hired veterans, homesteaders, even former rustlers who swore straight. She paid fair, rode hard, and stood tall. By 1895, she ran one of the most respected spreads in the territory, her brand known from Fort Laramie to Deadwood. She never remarried. When asked why, she'd nod toward the hills and say, "I already got a partner buried under that pine." On her 60th birthday, the governor rode out to present her with a silver star and a letter of recognition. She smiled, accepted it politely, and handed it to a young girl helping in the stable. "Means more if it's earned," she said. When Ellie passed in 1910, the entire county came to her funeral. Cowboys rode in from 3 states, and Old Cow, blind and slow, placed a sprig of pine at her grave. Her headstone reads, "Eleanor McCrae Rancher, widow, fighter." She didn't just survive, she won. And to this day, when the snow melts off the high ridges and the cattle start moving north, folks say they can still hear the thundering hooves of the Cattle Queen's vengeance, riding justice through the wilds of Wyoming. The Broken Spur Ranch. The land was tired, the fences sagging, and the house bore more scars than stories. Yet it stood stubbornly on the edge of Colorado territory, in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The Broken Spur Ranch had once been a proud name along the cattle trails, but now it was a whisper lost in the wind. Clara Estlin rode in on a pale Marais just before the thaw of 1887. She wore a long duster, a battered hat, and eyes set like flint. The ranch had belonged to her father, who died in debt and silence. Clara had been back east, learning figures and business things her father never understood. She returned not for nostalgia, but to reclaim what was left of her family's name. What she found was worse than expected. 2 hands remained old, Hodge and young Toby, loyal but worn thin by unpaid wages and broken dreams. The barn needed a new roof. The water pump wheezed like a dying mule, and buzzards circled low, watching with casual hunger. Worse still, the land notes had passed to a local banker, Saul Medford, who had no interest in cattle, but plenty in turning the ranch into timber and mining real estate. He gave Clara 60 days to pay the balance or vacate. "You've got spirit, Miss Estlin," he said, "but this is a man's world, and your ranch is past due." Clara nodded, smiled, and rode back without a word. The next day, she saddled up and rode out, visiting every neighbor, trail boss, and feed supplier within 30 miles. She worked from dawn until long after dark, trading her father's relics. For feed, taking notes from friends who owed him favors, and putting together a cattle drive with barely enough head to call a herd. By week's end, a few old ranchers had stepped in to help. There was Ruben Flores, a Mexican vaquero with a limp and a reputation for finding strays. Big Will Donnelly brought 5 wagons and his sons, all full of vinegar and fists. Even Eliza. Monroe, owner of the Moon River Trading Post, sent supplies with a wink and a note. "They think we can't. Prove 'em wrong." Clara worked with fire in her veins and plans in her ledger. She organized the branding, routed a path to Pueblo, and arranged a deal with a cattle broker willing to risk trade on credit. The drive had to succeed. Failure meant more than losing land. It meant erasing everything her father had built, flaws and all. Trouble started before the second camp. A rival outfit, the Thorne brothers, had been circling Clara's herd. They wanted the land and believed a woman wouldn't last a week with a drive. One night, they ran her steers into a box canyon and lit a grass fire to scatter them. Clara, Hodge and Will rode through smoke and ash to save what they could. In the chaos, Clara's horse fell, and she hit the rocks hard. When she woke, Toby was at her side, eyes wide with fear, but hands steady as he bandaged her ribs. "You stay still, Miss Clara," he said. "We ain't done yet." They pressed on. The drive took longer than planned. The river crossings were cold and high, and food ran low. But they made it to Pueblo with dust in their throats and grit in their eyes. The cattle sold fair, and the broker kept his word. Clara wired the money to Medford that same day. She returned home with just enough to patch the roof and pay the men. But something more valuable rode with her: respect. The townsfolk no longer called her the girl with the broken ranch, but Miss Estlin, who rides like a Comanche and plans like a general. Months passed. The broken spur began to show signs of life again. New calves in the pasture, fresh paint on the barn, and laughter from the bunkhouse. Clara kept her books tight and her gun closer. Medford never spoke to her again, but she knew. He watched from his windows. By winter, she had hired on 3 new hands, rebuilt the north fence, and turned the ranch into a stopover point for drovers heading west. She wasn't rich, but she was rooted. And sometimes, when the wind howled down from the mountains, Clara would sit by the fire, a cup of coffee in hand, and think of her father, flawed, stubborn, but full of fight. The Broken Spur Ranch stood again, not as it was, but as it needed to be, a place carved by grit, run by honor, and stitched together by the will of a woman who refused to let it die. Range wore redemption. The sun hung low over the New Mexico desert, burning gold through a cloud of dust. From the Mesa Ridge, the land stretched wide and raw, a canvas of red rock and thorny scrub. Below, the Cross Spur Ranch lay quiet, save for the soft clang of a hammer on iron and the occasional whinny of horses in the corral. It had been 10 years since Silas Creed last wore a gun belt in town. Once an outlaw feared across the Pecos, Silas had ridden hard, robbed harder, and vanished into legend. But men don't run forever. When he reappeared on the edge of Santa Rosa, gray at the temples and riding a half-lame Mustang, folks watched with a mix of suspicion and awe. The Cross Spur needed a foreman, and the ranch's owner, old Tom Beasley, remembered the boy Silas. Had once been, against every warning, Tom gave him the job. "This land's had enough blood," he said. "Time it had a man who knows what spilling it costs." Silas threw himself into the work. He fixed fences, trained colts, and kept the crew sober and sharp. The hands came to respect him, though few dared speak of the past. His revolver hung in the barn, untouched, gathering dust beneath his saddle. But peace, like rain in the desert, never lasts long. The Rocking M Ranch, run by the ambitious Malcolm Vane, had begun pushing its herd past the boundary markers. Vane claimed the land was his by treaty, though no one could find proof. With the railroads sniffing around and land agents in their pockets, Vane aimed to control every waterhole from Dry Butte to the Rio Puerco. Tom Beasley stood firm, refusing to sell, and soon his cattle turned up scattered or shot. A bunkhouse was burned, and one of the younger hands took a bullet near the border fence. Tom turned to Silas. "You know what they're trying to start," Tom said, his voice gravel thick. "And you know how to end it." Silas looked to the barn, where the revolver rested like a ghost. "They want a war," he said. "We give 'em a reckoning. But not their way, our way." He rode out, not with guns, but with words. He spoke to ranchers in the valley, men who feared Vane but hated his greed more. One by one, they pledged support, forming a loose pact of mutual defense. Together, they reinforced fences, posted watchmen at wells, and marked their claims with fresh brands and iron stakes. When Vane sent riders to intimidate, They found themselves met with calm hands and prepared neighbors. One night, Silas caught 3 of Vane's men cutting wire. He didn't draw, just told them to run while they could. They did, but Malcolm Vane didn't take kindly to being denied. He rode in with hired guns, 10 men strong, and called Silas out at the crossroads near Sand Hollow. Silas came alone, unarmed but unflinching. He offered Vane a deal. Bring your papers, bring your claims, and we'll let the courts settle it. Vane spat in the dust and drew first. Silas didn't flinch. A shot rang out from the ridge above. Tom Beasley, old but steady, had taken his place as lookout. Vane fell from the saddle, wounded in pride more than flesh. His men scattered, unwilling to die for a fight they never believed in. The law, slow but sure, arrived weeks later. Vane's claims fell apart under scrutiny. The cross spur and its neighbors held their ground, and a new peace settled over the range. Silas stayed on, older and wiser, a man who once brought fear, now carrying something stronger, respect. When he passed in the spring of '98, they buried him beneath the old juniper at the ranch's edge. On his marker, they carved the words, "He rode hard, but he finished right." And so the land remembered not just the outlaw Silas had been, but the man he chose to become. Barbed wire and bloodlines. The wind across the Llano Estacado carried whispers of trouble. It was the spring of 1882, and the grass was just starting to return after a hard winter. On the edge of the Texas Panhandle, the Bishop Ranch sat quiet, but alert, nestled between 2 shallow creeks and miles of hard-earned land. Josiah Bishop had run cattle there for over 20 years, carving a homestead out of scrub and sweat. But now, the fences were being tested. Josiah was a quiet man, built broad like a bull and slow to anger, but when it came, his fury was legend from Amarillo to Abilene. He had 4 sons, all grown and scattered across the frontier, except the youngest, Eli. Eli stayed on, helping, with the branding, the bookkeeping, and the quiet moments when the work was done. And only the coyotes sang. They had always run their herd free range, letting the cattle graze open prairie and marking boundaries only with markers and mutual respect. But change was coming. Barbed wire had arrived. Across the Bishop land, new settlers were fencing in claims, driven by government grants and the promise of a better life. To Josiah, it felt like a noose tightening around his legacy. Worse still, the richest of these newcomers, a railroad-backed cattleman named Preston Hawley, had begun stringing wire across disputed borders, and some of that land, Josiah swore, was Bishop soil. It began with missing steers, then came slashed water lines, a poisoned salt lick, and finally, a fire that took half a barn. Eli wanted to ride into Hale's camp, guns blazing, but Josiah said no. We fight this with our heads, not our hands. Not yet. Then came the letter, written in a hand Josiah hadn't seen in 20 years. It bore the name Daniel Bishop, Josiah's second son, presumed dead in a mining accident back in '68. The letter said Daniel was alive and working as a foreman for Preston High. Josiah said nothing for a full day, just rode the fences, eyes scanning for breaks in wire or truth. When he returned, he gathered Eli and rode east to the disputed pasture lands. There, by a cottonwood, Daniel was waiting. He looked older, leaner, with a scar across his jaw and guilt in his eyes. "I didn't know it was you, Pa. Not until a week ago. I thought Hale was just buying up bad land. I swear it." Josiah said nothing. Eli gripped his reins, itching to speak, but Daniel held up a hand. "He's planning to take it all, Pa. The ranch, the herd, your name. He knows the law is slow and the courts are far. He hired me to draw maps, but he's already got a team of riders marking fence posts through every free-range claim west of the Pecos. "Why are you telling us this now?" Eli growled. "Because blood runs deeper than wire, and because I owe you both." That night, the Bishop men returned home and drew up a plan. Over the next 2 weeks, they rallied old Allies ranchers squeezed by Hale's growing empire. The Menendez brothers from the old Pecos Trail, Luella Grant from Dry Fork, and even old Red Murphy, who once tried to steal Josiah's cattle during a flood, came riding in. Together, they cut Hale's wire at night, rebuilt broken pumps, and documented every inch of Bishop land. When Howley sent men to stop them, the Bishop riders were waiting. There was no bloodshed, just a long, dusty standoff at Bitter Creek. When Howley himself arrived, flanked by lawyers and surveyors, Josiah stood tall beside his sons. "You want to take this land, Mr. Howley? Then bring papers, not pistols. We'll see what the courts say." But Josiah had more than old claims. Daniel had slipped them Hale's ledgers, proof of illegal seizures, forged deeds, and bribes paid to land agents. The evidence was delivered to the circuit judge in Wichita Falls by Luella herself. The court case dragged through the summer, but by fall, the verdict was clear. The Bishop land stayed Bishop land. Howley was fined and stripped of his claims. Daniel stayed on after that, helping rebuild the barn and riding fence with Eli. The two brothers, once strangers, found a new rhythm not always easy, but honest. And Josiah, though older now, rode the land with quiet pride. They replaced the old markers with barbed wire of their own, not to fence others out, but to show the line they had drawn, not just in soil, but in blood and honor. In later years, folks would ride past the Bishop Ranch and see the strong fences, the full herds, and the sign at the gate. Bishop land, earned and defended. And they'd know, in that stretch of wild Texas, barbed wire didn't just hold cattle, it held history. Dust and honor. The year was 1871, and the Texas plains rolled on like an endless ocean of grass and dust. Jacob Holloway rode alone beneath the burning sky, his eyes set on the horizon, where land and sky seemed to meet in silence. He was a man with a past full of war, scars, and lost time. Jacob had fought in the Civil War, wearing the gray of the South. When it ended, he had nothing but his horse and a promise he once made to a friend who didn't survive. That promise led him west, where he bought a small ranch near the Brazos River. There he raised cattle, kept to himself, and tried to forget the things he'd seen. He found peace in hard work, in the quiet rhythm of sunrise rides and evening fires. But the West doesn't let a man forget, and it sure doesn't stay quiet for long. Jacob's ranch lay in the path of a new railroad line. Men from the Great Western Rail Company came with maps, ink, and offers. They wanted to run steel tracks through his land, paying little and taking much. Jacob refused. Soon after, fences were cut, his barn set on fire, and his water stolen. Hired guns began to circle like buzzards. Jacob knew this wasn't just business, it was a war of a different kind. The company wanted his land, but Jacob had something stronger than contracts: grit and a promise to protect what was his. Then one day, a boy arrived. 15 years old, tall for his age, but thin from travel. His name was Luke, and he was Jacob's son. Jacob hadn't seen Luke since the boy was a baby. His mother, Jacob's late wife, had died back east, and Luke had been raised by her sister. Now, after a fight and a long journey, Luke had come to find the father he'd never known. The letter he carried was wrinkled and worn, ink faded, but the message was clear. Come if you're ready to know the truth. The reunion wasn't easy. Jacob was quiet, hard, and rough as the land he worked. Luke was curious, proud, and angry. But slowly, over days of fixing fences, branding cattle, and riding out to check water lines, they found a rhythm. They shared quiet meals, worked side by side, and slowly learned to trust one another. Jacob began to teach Luke not just how to ride and shoot, but how to stand tall. "Out here," he said, "your name's worth more than gold. A man's got his land, his word, and his honor. Lose any one of those, and you're lost." They rode together, checking fence lines and tracking strays. Jacob showed Luke how to read the signs of the land hoof prints in dry dirt, the bent grass of a passing herd, the shimmer of heat over a watering hole. Luke learned fast. He was eager to prove himself. Trouble came again when a group of hired guns rode in, led by a man named Crowley. He wore a black hat, a silver vest, and had a voice like broken glass. Crowley offered one last chance: sell the land or face the fire. Jacob stood firm. Luke stood with him. That night, under a moon sharp as a knife, the fight came. Jacob and Luke, along with a few neighbors, faced off against Crowley's men. It wasn't long, but it was loud and deadly. Gunshots echoed across the plains like thunder. Jacob took a bullet to the leg. Luke stood over him, rifle shaking in his hands, but he held the line. Smoke clung to the air. Horses screamed and scattered. Crowley's men, seeing the resolve in the eyes of the ranchers, turned tail and rode out into the night. When the dust settled, the land was still theirs. News of the fight spread. The railroad backed off, seeing too much cost in more conflict. Jacob recovered slowly. Luke stayed. Over time, they built more than fences and barns. They built a bond. They repaired what had been broken between them. Luke took to ranch life with purpose, bringing in fresh ideas and young energy. Jacob taught with stories, and Luke listened, not just with ears, but with heart. Neighbors came to admire the Holloway Ranch, not for its size, but for the spirit it held. Jacob and Luke welcomed travelers, offered shelter during storms, and helped with branding roundups in the spring. They became known as fair dealers and honest men. Years later, folks said the Holloway Ranch stood not because it was big, but because it was built on honor. Jacob and Luke worked side by side, turning the dusty land into a place of peace. When Jacob passed on, Luke took his father's place, carrying on the legacy with steady hands and a proud name. And though the world changed around them with telegraph wires stretching like spider webs and towns growing from tents to timber, some things stayed the same. The land, the cattle, the values. Honor passed down like a family brand, steady and true. They never forgot the lesson that shaped their bond. A man's honor, like good land, must be fought for and passed on.